Let's bring in president of the Center of the American Experiment and co-founder of the popular Powerline blog, John Hinderaker. The mayhem is happening in your home state. ICE is operating around the US, but it's only in Minnesota that we are seeing this sort of violent uprising on a regular basis, with law enforcement being obstructed, being attacked. And we also had this storming of a church that has led to the arrest of Don Lemon.
Yeah, the reason, Rita, is that our elected officials, starting with Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, are openly encouraging the rioting and the interfering with ICE's efforts to apprehend illegal aliens, which of course is a federal crime. These officials are trying to make it impossible to enforce federal law in Minnesota. It is very much like what states like South Carolina did in the years leading up to the Civil War. Tim Walz has even talked publicly about being at war with the federal government. It has referred to Fort Sumter, which of course is where the Civil War began, when South Carolina troops fired on a Union fort. And Tim Walz is actually invoking that. So the reason why things are so crazy in Minnesota, at least the primary reason, is because our elected officials are actively encouraging the lawlessness.
And they may have some motivation to do that, because Minnesota was caught in an unprecedented fraud scandal, and we're not talking about that anymore. And President Donald Trump has said that fraud in Minnesota is worse than what has been reported. He wrote, the theft and fraud in Minnesota is far greater than the $19 billion originally projected. The Biden administration knew this fraud was happening and did absolutely nothing about it. John, he's singled out Democrat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and the Governor Tim Walz as being complicit in this unprecedented fraud. Do you see it that way?
Well, what's basically happening here, Rita, is that this was a vote-buying scheme. Certainly, Governor Tim Walz knew that frauds were going on. Ilhan Omar knew they were going on, and they did nothing because they wanted to encourage all of this money flowing out into the Somali community. What happened here is that the DFL party pumped billions and billions of dollars into the Somali community here in Minnesota and created a voting bloc that is decisive in close elections. So it didn't make any difference to Tim Walz or Ilhan Omar whether the dollars that were being pumped out were legitimate or were fraudulent. They were dollars that were going to their voters. Now, Ilhan Omar drafted the law that created the program that enabled the $500 million Feeding Our Future fraud. And she also reported her own financial reports that her net worth went from essentially zero to $30 million in 1 year. Now, is there a connection? We don't know, but she certainly benefits from the Somali voting bloc that those government programs have created.
And talking about the Governor, Tim Walz there, his complicity in the dysfunction in Minnesota, the fraud in Minnesota, was discussed earlier today. Let's hear from David Hosh. He's the independent journalist who featured in Nick Shirley's videos exposing fraud in Minnesota. He testified to lawmakers on Capitol Hill earlier today.
So going back to whether Governor Walz knew about it, Governor Walz admitted knowing about the fraud early in his first term, which would say 2020. Well, Minnesota Statute 3.971, Subdivision 9, clearly says that if you are made aware of fraud in a state agency, you are obligated to immediately report that fraud to the Office of the Legislative Auditor, immediately.
John, Tim Walz did not report the fraud to the Office of the Legislative Auditor. He claims he did tell the FBI. Will there be any sort of reckoning for his lack of leadership, whether it was ineptness or complicity? It really doesn't matter. He was governor and he seemed to not have his mind on the job. We know he's not running again, but could he possibly have an investigation into how he handled this matter?
Well, first of all, Rita, the claim that you just heard there by Tim Walz that he somehow called in the FBI, he tipped off the FBI, that was investigated by the Minnesota Legislative Auditor, and it was found to be false. Walz didn't notify the FBI. It was the FBI that came to Walz and said that they were about to execute search warrants in connection with what became known as the Feeding Our Future fraud. The prosecution of that massive fraud was carried out entirely by the federal government, the FBI and the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota. They've charged, I think, 78 criminal defendants now. Tim Walz and his Attorney General had nothing to do with it. They played no role whatsoever. They were bystanders at best and beneficiaries of the fraud. So as you said, Tim Walz has been pulled out of the race by the National Democratic Party. His political career appears to be over, and there are reports that he's been referred to for some criminal investigation. I'm doubtful that's going to go anywhere, but we'll see what happens.
Now, I think we should leave the last word about Governor Tim Walz to Senator John Kennedy from the great state of Louisiana.
Governor Tim Walz, whatever he says, believe the opposite. I'm sorry, the man learned to lie before he learned to talk. He's just a.
I can't help it. You crack me up.
Well, he's just a less masculine version of Hillary Clinton.
Oh man.
Tim Walz is a less masculine version of Hillary Clinton. That's going to stick in my mind. Now, let's have a look at this clash between Senator Ted Cruz and the co-CEO of Netflix during a Senate hearing on Netflix's pending $83 billion attempt to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery's streaming and studio assets.
Look, Netflix has long been a left-wing company. Your founder, Reed Hastings, is one of the biggest Democrat donors in the country, including giving millions recently to the massive gerrymander in California, making it one of the most gerrymandered states in the union, because your founder desperately wants a Democrat House of Representatives. Susan Rice from the Obama White House is on your board of directors. You guys gave $50 million to the Obamas, as far as I can tell, to produce no discernible content whatsoever. How would you tell a Texan sitting at home to feel comfortable? CNN is already a dumpster fire. There's nothing resembling objectivity. There's nothing resembling journalism anymore. How are people at home, how should they feel even remotely confident that if this merger happens, the combined entity would not simply be a propaganda outlet pushing one particular political view with much greater market power than you have now?
Well, sir, we would fail. We would fail pushing a political view or propaganda. We deliver entertainment to consumers. Our consumers see our business pretty much the way they see America. About 40% conservative, about 40% liberal, about 20% don't know.
Oh, John, that's not at all accurate, is it? Netflix's political bias is pretty evident in its programming, throughout its programming, even children's programming, and to pretend otherwise is really insulting the audience.
Rita, the entire entertainment industry is left-wing, almost without exception. And Netflix is notoriously liberal. There are these Netflix memes, and you've seen them. You know what I'm talking about. Netflix takes a program, and then there's the Netflix version. And in the Netflix version, all the characters are non-white and gay. It is a standing joke. We see it all the time. Yes. These people are not fooling anyone.
They're not. And to go to that Senate hearing and just deny the obvious. I mean, it's one thing to say we exist in an industry where the artistic community leans a certain way, so the content they produce is naturally going to be left-leaning. You could make an explanation for it, but just to deny the reality is just so insulting to the audience. Now, before you go, the French cybercrime unit has raided the Paris offices of Elon Musk's X as part of a year-long investigation, and they have summoned the billionaire to front a hearing over his platform's suspected algorithm abuse and what they call fraudulent data extraction. But John, I do suspect this has got a lot more to do with Elon Musk being a free speech warrior and not allowing the bureaucratic class to dictate what people can say and discuss online.
Rita, there's a huge battle over free speech going on in Europe, and a big part of it has to do with social media. The European Union has adopted the Digital Services Act, which requires platforms like X to engage in content moderation under very vague standards. And many people think that what they're going to suppress is conservative content and content that is critical of their own government. So the US has been pushing back against those efforts. What I suspect is going on here is part of that larger battle over whether American ideas of free speech will prevail in Europe or whether European censorship will be imposed on American companies.
John Hinderaker, thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Rita.